Alright, so today I wanted to talk about the recent rumors about the upcoming MacBook Pro lineup. Um, just jumping right into it. So, the big rumor is that Apple's going back on their decision about USB-C and that the new MacBook Pros are going to have a new version of the MagSafe charger and some non-USB-C I/O. So, basically what happened in 2016 for the MacBook Pro specifically, or the MacBook Pro lineup, was Apple redesigned the 13-inch and the 15-inch models, and they removed all of the previous I/O in favor of 4 USB-C Thunderbolt 3 ports. So overall it's more expandable, but it was, it required everyone to get docks for like the regular USB-A drives and for display output, and it changed the charger to USB-C from MagSafe 2, which had already been changed from MagSafe 1 a couple of years earlier. So it was a whole thing, but I kind of liked it. I mean, there's some issues with USB-C, specifically because it's so high voltage. It can cause problems in certain things. Basically, just look at any any real difficult board repair on Louis Rossman's channel having to do with the USB-C MacBooks, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But basically, so the reason this is so big is because MagSafe was actually liked. MagSafe was preferred over basically every other charging standard. Not because it was particularly fast or it was, it wasn't very special at actually charging the device, but it was convenient because, as the name suggests, MagSafe is just a magnetic cable tip that just clicks onto your laptop, so there's no fiddling around with where the port is. If it ever comes off, if you ever yank the cable, it just just kind of lightly plucked off instead of yanking your whole laptop. And them removing that was it was kind of lame because MagSafe's cool. And the reason this seems like one of those rumors that's it's a rumor, but it's definitely also not a rumor. This seems pretty legit, and I believe it, but I'm a bit confused as to why Apple's making this decision now. But I think that genuinely it really just has to do with the limitations of M1. So with the new M1 processor in the new MacBook Air, MacBook Pro 13-inch, and Mac Mini, the M1's biggest limitation is I/O. So whereas some of these devices had up to 4 USB-C Thunderbolt 3 ports before, the M1 machines can only do up to 2 Thunderbolt ports. So the Mac Mini lost some I/O, and the MacBook Pro 13-inch only comes with the new processor only comes in the 2 Thunderbolt port option. And so that was pretty eye-opening as to the I/O limitations of Apple's new chip versus Intel's long-established going all into something like Thunderbolt. And so yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense that, so, to give Apple enough time to figure out that I/O bottleneck, they just separate your, the charging and the I/O again with MagSafe. Also, MagSafe, USB-C has caused a lot of issues for them. It's a nice connector, and I'd be extremely skeptical of claims that there specifically won't be a USB-C port. If there isn't a USB-C port on the newer Macs, I would be very surprised. But it's not. I think the focus is to move that port away from charging, so that you can get 1 or 2 USB-C ports that you can get the full data capabilities out of, and then maybe charge off of something else, or maybe to have a base model with a charging port and a single USB, something like that. They can kind of mix and match the I/O a little bit better if they separate charging, or if they de-emphasize charging. Maybe it's still enabled on the USB-C side, but it's not preferred, and the cable that comes in the box is MagSafe. So yeah, it saves them certain repairs, like I was talking about with the with the voltage weirdness on those motherboards, and it saves the like physical connector failure, because MagSafe hardly ever failed. Usually it's when MagSafe or MagSafe 2 in the past failed, it was because the entire DC inboard was faulty for X or Y reason, and so it wasn't just one. It wasn't just one port. It was like a whole board that was like relatively easy to replace. Now, I highly doubt that the new standard in the newer design Macs would be on a separate daughter board. I'm just saying that I don't think that physical connector failure would be as big an issue, because it doesn't present itself in the same way. You're not like breaking off the connector tip or something like that. Like it's more so just, oh, my laptop doesn't charge now, what do I do? And like cleaning the charge port is easier because it's more shallow, because it's just magnetic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting decision, and it's pretty cool to see MagSafe probably come back. It sort of also makes it more apparent why they would bring back the MagSafe nomenclature with the iPhones, which had never had anything to do with MagSafe before. And where their MagSafe on the iPhones is completely different than it ever looked like on a Mac. I mean, it's a big circular wireless charging pad, whereas for Macs it was a little rectangular like set of metal pads. You know, like it was definitely much less modern Apple design in that sense. But if you think about it, Apple had been producing the MagSafe connector, or machines with the MagSafe connector, as late as 2017, because it took all the way until 2017 for them to refresh the MacBook Air with a quote-unquote Retina SKU. So the MacBook Air had the same design it had had since like 2010, all the way up until 2017. So MagSafe was still being shipped with new devices only a few short years ago. So, you know, it makes sense that the complaints about MagSafe are still pretty prevalent, because MagSafe was like really nice, and it was only fully removed from the lineup quite recently. In terms of other I/O, because the leak didn't specify other I/O, it just said like there's gonna be more I/O than the current Macs, and that's a little bit confusing, because I'm not sure why they would go out of their way to possibly chunk up the laptops again. Like the whole point of making everything USB-C was so that they could fit everything into a smaller package. And so the rumor is that, like, in terms of the external design, that they're going to make everything flat edges. I envision, maybe not quite as harshly, but I envision sort of a Razer-esque design language. I feel like the new MacBooks will probably look closer to a Razer Blade than a traditional MacBook, if the rumors are to be believed on the design, and that might let them fit in some wider ports. But I don't see them going back to something as big as like HDMI, or something as reliable as like, or as unreliable as like mini HDMI. So I assume that things like display output are going to be solely handled by whatever amount of USB-C ports show up on there. The only thing I could really see them adding is like maybe micro SD expansion and like SD card expansion if they really have a lot of space. I could see them, you know, audio jack, of course. I just don't know what else they would do, because USB-C became like a really big part of their lineup. Like, I get why they want to do a new charger, but I don't see where USB-C is going. You know, I don't see where a removal of USB-C makes sense in all of this. And so let's assume that they don't really change the I/O. Let's say it's just 2 USB-C ports, but now there's also a MagSafe connector. What was the point? That's potentially like millions in R&D for a charge port that Apple may not even continue to use past those products. So I don't know what the end goal here is. As with a lot of these leaks, they confuse me because I don't see the bigger picture. The bigger picture being the final product and Apple's marketing in terms of like how they pose the argument. Because it didn't make 100%. It didn't make a ton of sense to me when I heard the leaks about MagSafe on the iPhone, because I was like, oh, okay, so they just want to put magnets around the wireless charging pad to make it so you click it in easier. Cool, but what else? Like, what's your end goal here? And then I guess I haven't seen the product yet, but like the end goal for MagSafe on iPhone seems to be for iPhones to be portless, which, okay, yeah, but you know, I talked about that a little while ago. Like you have to sort of create that problem to solve that problem. Here, Apple doesn't have a problem to solve or create, really. They're solving a problem that doesn't exist, which is confusing me. Like, there's nothing wrong with USB-C, and people are relatively, like, it's annoying, but the people are used to it, and I don't know, I don't see how MagSafe fits in to the modern Mac lineup. I think Apple's trying to do something else here. You know, like, because the only thing I could really think of that is, like, that would be nice to have a charge port separately from USB-C is, I think I said it earlier, but I'll try to be a bit more clear about it, is on the MacBook, which is a laptop we've not seen a refresh for since 2015. MacBook was the first laptop with USB-C, or the first MacBook in the whole lineup that had USB-C, and it was a redesign of MacBook and a relaunching of the base MacBook brand. And that laptop, among other things, was the first to have USB-C, but it only had USB-C was its weird quirk, and it wasn't even Thunderbolt yet. At the time, the 2015 MacBook was just doing USB 3 for the USB-C port. So it was one port for charging and for data. It wasn't even that versatile because it was basically a glorified USB 3.1 port. And there was a headphone jack. Like that was all the I/O you got on that laptop. So I could see if they want to relaunch MacBook, if they want to really undercut the Air pricing and just kind of split up the Air market, they can re-release MacBook with just one Thunderbolt port for, so that people can hook up all their docks and stuff, and a MagSafe connector. And then that lets them do I/O and charging. But literally, that's the only device I can think of in their whole lineup that is I/O limited, and it doesn't even exist in their current lineup. Like, I don't think you can buy MacBook brand new from Apple. I don't think you've been able to for like a little while now. So yeah, I just don't see it. It's an interesting rumor. I just don't see it. What was more interesting to me was the rumors about the external design changes. I think tapered MacBooks going away in favor of flat-edged and rounded cornered, like super mega thin bezeled laptops. I think that's fine. I think that'll be a welcome change. They might be more Razer-esque, like I said, but I think the tapered design has gotten a little bit old, and as we've seen on the iPhones, going back to flat edges has let Apple sort of flex their engineering abilities in terms of how much they can cram into one space. So I think with a flat design, I think MacBooks will probably be a little bit better internally engineered, and they'll probably look nicer because I prefer the Blade aesthetic over the MacBook aesthetic. The final part of this rumor, aside from the I/O, aside from the external design redesign and all that, the big thing that is simultaneously surprising me and not at all surprising me is the possible removal of the Touch Bar. So if you don't know, since that MacBook Pro redesign, I believe back in 2016. It didn't exist on the entire lineup. It does now, but Apple created the Touch Bar, which replaces all of the function keys on the keyboard, and for a long time the escape key. Now there's a physical escape key on laptops with the Touch Bar. But basically what the Touch Bar did was, instead of having physical function key buttons that you could switch between function actions and the actual like function keys, like the F1, F2, F11, like, I don't know why I jumped to F11, but you get the idea. So instead of like switching between those actions with like a hotkey with physical keys, they just give you a long strip screen that you can touch. It's a little touch screen, and it adapts to whatever you're doing. So theoretically, it's a little bit more intuitive because it will change, like the buttons can change to show you what you're doing. Say you go to brightness toggle, now it's not just 2 buttons, it might give you a slider or whatever, you know. It's cool, but it's mostly a gimmick. I don't think I've ever seen the touch bar used for more than some basic like quick access things for things like brightness and volume control. I've seen some quirky stuff on it, like someone put Doom on there because of course someone put Doom on there on just the touch bar. But the touch bar is problematic because the touch bar is a huge point of failure for these machines. Something that a lot of people don't know about the touch bar is it actually doesn't, to my knowledge, it doesn't run natively from the operating system or from the machine itself. Rather, the touch bar has its own like processor essentially, not in the sense that it's like an iPhone inside a MacBook, but it runs mostly independently of the system and sort of is plugged in. And so it has its own firmware, like it's its own thing, and the touch bar fails pretty often, and when the touch bar fails, it affects the performance and the usability of the whole machine. So it makes sense why Apple would want to get rid of the touch bar, especially if it's been causing more issues than it has been solving, with shortcuts and stuff like that. And I think it's one theory I heard was that Apple looks at their like usage metrics, and they're probably saying that not a ton of people use the touch bar for very long or for very complex tasks. So what's the point of having this super complex like piece of touchable glass with its own logic and its own like software and firmware when no one uses it, right? Simplify the manufacturing cost and the like time and the whole thing, make the device less fragile, and remove functionality that no one was using anyway, and make the whole thing just more, make more sense. Removing the touch bar reminds me of when they removed 3D touch from iPhones, both in software and eventually in hardware. When in software, being because it no longer, the context menus could just be brought up with a long press, and that long press came about from the hardware shift of Apple realizing that putting 3D touch in screens is super expensive, makes the screens thicker physically, and no one was using it. So he looked at the usage statistics on 3D touch and contextual menus, and while enough people use it to keep the feature around, and it would be kind of outrageous if they remove the feature entirely, they're able to just reduce it to software, and now it's haptic touch, right? So instead of it being this like physical part of the manufacturing process that makes everything more complicated, you just make a stopgap in software and then you leave it. So that's kind of where I think touch bar would be going, in a sense. Is I think that they're similar to something like Spotlight Search. I think there could be like a touch bar utilities menu that you could probably bring up, like that. That's kind of my thought process. Like maybe you like you like touch at like the Touch ID button or something like that, or you put in a keybind and then it brings up a touch bar menu, like a quick menu that sits like above the dock, and then you can on screen do all those controls. Another thing I've heard is like maybe they're removing the touch bar because they're just gonna make the whole screen a touch screen. Maybe Apple's gonna finally make Macs touchscreen laptops, and they could. It's not out of the realm of possibility, especially with Big Sur. I think Big Sur has made everything a little bit more touchable. Like context menus are bigger and visually more like friendly looking to fingers. Like they're not everything is in like thin small text menus. A lot of things are like big colorful circles. So I could see them doing touch on a MacBook, but I don't know if they want to, because then that undercuts their whole point of like the iPad being a possible laptop replacement. There's a lot of things going on here. These rumors are big because they're not insignificant. Like they seem dumb. It's like, oh, okay, they're redesigning no touch bar. Like things that like other manufacturers, like, yeah, okay, yeah, they just changed the laptop. But because of the way Apple structures their lineup and because everything is so tight knit, it's big when they remove long time features like that, or features that they once put lots of importance on and then could possibly just be thrown to the wayside. Because I genuinely don't know how they would compensate for not having a touch bar, or if they would even bother. Like, is it that bad that no one uses their touch bar, and that they have to fully just kill it? Like, I'm not sure. I don't know. While I would personally prefer for the touch bar to go away because of its ability to just break everything, it's certainly not useless. Like, there's people that use the touch bar for things, I'm sure. So I don't know. I'm curious to see what Apple's move here is, and about the whole thing. I really, at this point, I'm more keen on seeing their devices this year, because I was thinking that this year maybe wouldn't be a big year for Apple in terms of external design changes. My thought process is sort of that they would just bring ARM to the rest of the Mac lineup and then focus on redesigns maybe later in the year or next year. But it seems like as soon as like summer they could be doing a new iMac, doing the new MacBook Pros. Like, there's a lot of rumors floating around that things are happening sort of sooner rather than later, and that's surprising. I don't know. I'm curious now. So yeah, I mean, I think that's about it. More of the story, closing thoughts. At the end of the day, these are just rumors. They're just kind of they're fun to talk about because, why not? But they're all kind of stupid. And if you don't own a Mac, and if you're not planning to own a Mac, these are inconsequential to you. You can sit on your PCMR throne and just, bask in having I/O for years. But but it's fun to think about this kind of stuff. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you maybe you're thinking about buying a MacBook now, because surely that's what Apple wants you to think about. So no, but that's gonna be it for me. I'll see you later. Have a good night.